Hi, this is Brian Gibbons, and I want to welcome you to Lease Option Assignments or Cooperative Assignments or Wholesaling Lease Options, whatever you want to call it. It's basically what you're going to do is you're going to help the seller sell on a lease option. You're going to enter that particular lease and an option in your name, in your company name, your LLC name, not your private name. And then you're going to assign or sell your interest in the agreement. And really, you should use an option release technique. Actually, lease optioning to the seller, I would cloud the title and record your option. And then, once that's done, you're going to have the buyer pay you a fee to be able to release your option. We call it a release option fee, but that's just the mechanics of the paperwork. But it's basically you're selling your option to the buyer for a fee. The seller wins because he gets top sales price for his house. And we generally like to do this model without agents involved. So if you have a house that's listed with an agent, basically have the seller get the agent to release the listing. Or just wait for the listing to expire and work expired leads too. We work expireds, we work listed houses, and we work with wholesalers too. Wholesalers have thin deals that don't have enough equity in the deal. So let's say they had a 15% equity position, the wholesaler can't do anything with that. So the purpose of this particular recording is, why do I love lease options as a real estate trainer? And we train on everything. We train on wholesaling, we train on retailing or rehabbing, we train on Sub2, we train on wraparound mortgages and AITDs, we train on private money. But this, in my opinion, is the best possible way to get started in real estate in 2013. Why? Because it's simple, and I'm going to go through in this recording how it compares with a Sub2, how it compares with a Sandwich Lease Option, how it compares with retailing. Okay, so let's get started. Thanks a lot for joining us at reiskills.com talking about lease option assignments. Let's get started. All right, so I put this up, objectives to meet my business model. Now, why did I do this? I want chunk cash in 60 days or less working a deal. So I'd like to get a $5,000 check or more for each particular transaction. And another objective for me is I don't want to manage property or hire a property manager. I don't want to do that. So I don't want to buy and hold and keep an eye on tenants. I want something relatively fast, and I consider relatively fast 10 hours a deal or less. So, divide 10 hours into 5,000, that's 500 an hour. Now, you don't make $500 every hour, but I want to make that money relatively fast within 10 hours a deal. And I also want a win-win between the seller and the buyer, not a win-lose. All right? So, if you see at the top, lease option assignments versus wholesaling. Can we get chunk cash in wholesaling? Yes, we can. Wholesaling, if you don't know what it means, we have a video on just wholesaling and how it works. But wholesaling basically is you find something run down that needs work, you get an option of purchase agreement on the seller, and then you get that option of purchase agreement and you shop it with the buyer's list. And the buyer's list will give you a certain amount of money for that agreement if you can get it cheap enough. All right. So you can get chunk cash comparing it with wholesaling. Wholesaling, you can do that. So that's a good thing. Are you going to hire a property manager? Probably not. But you do, if you just sell it to a rehabber, you're out of the deal quickly. So number 2 doesn't matter. And if you want something relatively fast, and this is where it's a big question mark, if you don't have a big buyer's list, a great buyer's list that wants exactly what you're going after, it might take you a lot more than 10 hours a deal. And is it a win-win between the seller and the buyer? In wholesaling, the seller loses generally. They generally have to settle for a lot less money. Most wholesaling deals, they could pretty the house up in a small amount of money, let's say under $5,000, and get top sales price for their house if they had the money to pretty it up. But most of the wholesaling deals, the seller just doesn't have any money at all to make it marketable, and that's why the model works. All right, so that's basically comparing lease option assignments with wholesaling. Now let's talk about rehabbing, and that's got to do with using contractors and doing a good amount of work. This is what I call working with a hammer instead of a pen. I'd rather work with a pen than a hammer. Okay, so lease option assignments versus rehabbing. I want chunk cash. Well, generally it takes a while to get chunk cash when you sell it to the retail buyer, and it's like 3 to 6 months down the road. You don't want to manage the property or hire a property manager. Yeah, that's true, but you're going to need to hire contractors and supervise their work and make sure they don't go over budget when you're rehabbing. Is it something relatively fast? Definitely not. To me, it's a long-term project, and I don't have 10 hours a week to watch this thing. Is it a win-win between the seller and the buyer? It depends. Sometimes the seller wins, sometimes the seller loses. The buyer is buying at retail, so that's, they're not losing. Subject to. Subject to means buying the property subject to existing financing. It's generally get the deed. It's generally used with a land trust. And dealing with subject to properties, if you find something with no equity and your exit strategy is to rent it out or to rent to own the property, you might want to do that. Can you get chunk cash on a subject to? Generally, you just take over existing financing. And I like to get the seller to pay at least 2 more months before I take over the existing financing. Can you get chunk cash? It really depends on the location, depends on the what kind of shape the house is in, if it doesn't need any work at all, even a cleanup work like paint and carpet. It depends whether or not you get chunk cash on a subject to deal. If you don't want to manage the property or hire a property manager, if I'm going to rent it out or do a rent to own and hold it, then that's not going to work. I want something relatively fast, 10 hours a deal or less. You can do subject twos very, very quickly. And especially if you work with an attorney that specializes in real estate transactions, very, very important that you obey the rules of a subject to deal. And I don't want to get into that, how to stay out of hot water with a subject to. But there is a due on sale clause issue, and we go through that stuff in our subject to training. And I want a win-win between the seller and the buyer. If the property has no equity and you can't afford to sell with an agent and you buy it on subject to, chances are that's a win-win as long as you make those payments. There's no legal reason to make the payments. There's a moral obligation if you buy it on subject to, and generally to make the seller feel comfortable that if we miss one mortgage payment, they get the title back. Okay? But they do have to agree if we sell this on rent to own, they have to honor that rent to own agreement. Okay, so that's a subject to comparison. Now, comparing it with a sandwich lease option, and this is where my students, when they get involved with lease options, I get very, very concerned for them if they want to do sandwiches and they don't have a lot of money. They don't have more than $1,000 in the bank. They're undercapitalized as a business, and they're just doing anything to get a deal done. So how does it compare? I want chunk cash in a sandwich lease option. For you that don't know about a sandwich, you are in the middle of 2 pieces of bread and you're the meat. Okay? So on the 2 pieces of bread, the seller is one piece and the buyer is another, and you're in between. Okay? So you're leasing from the seller and you have an option to buy from the seller. And then you're also subleasing and sub-optioning to the buyer. So that's why it's called a sandwich lease option. Now, can you get chunk cash? Well, yeah, you can if you give $10 to the seller and then you get 3% or $5,000 from the buyer. Yeah, you can get chunk cash for that. but you're going to have to keep an eye on this thing. You're going to have to hire a property manager or do it yourself. Can you get a deal done in 10 hours or less? Chances are you can do that. Do you want a win-win between the seller and the buyer? Yeah, you can put a win-win with a sandwich lease option. You can, but you got to keep an eye on this. And there's risk to a sandwich. And the big risk is what? If the tenant buyer doesn't pay you. If they don't pay you, you're on the hook for the payment to the seller. So, what can you do here? Let's go through some frequently asked questions. And this has got to do with the contracts. So on a lease option assignment, just so you understand what it is, I am leasing with an option to buy from a seller in my company name. Then I am going to assign the deal or sell my interest for a fee. Why do we use two separate agreements? Why do we use a lease and then a separate option to purchase with the buyer? Why do we do that? Why do we do that from the seller and the buyer? We just sell our agreement and we get an option release fee from that. Well, it's got to do with the courts. And the courts, basically, you want a landlord-tenant relationship, a very strong one, and that lease describes all the moving parts with that. Then you want a separate option agreement. And if the tenant buyer doesn't pay their lease payment, you can evict. Okay? And you can have the option agreement, and you can have it talk about, paying the lease on time. Otherwise, it's going to be in violation of their option agreement. Okay. So, why should your houses be in good neighborhoods, safe areas, and near services like malls and freeways? Well, that's what people want. They don't want a long commute. They want to be able to get to work and come back. They want to be able to go shopping, and they want a safe environment. They want the best schools in the area. They want their kids to go out and play in the street. They want to be able to go have their 8-year-old child go down to the playground and come back and not be in any trouble when they walk back. So if you see that web link, neighborhoodscout.com, that is a free web service that talks about how can we get the safest neighborhoods with the highest appreciation rates, the lowest crime, and the best schools. So make sure you write that down. Why work with single-family homes that have 3 to 4 bedrooms, 2-car garage, lots of storage, near good schools, homes are in good shape, and you get a property inspection and the seller pays for that, and a clear title, a preliminary title report? Why do you do that when you work with lease option assignments? Well, we want a good product. We want a good product in a good location, and that product's in good shape, and so that the buyer says, oh, you've already got a prelim, the title's clear. Oh, you've already got a property inspection. So it's kind of like getting a car, and you're buying a car, and you've already done an inspection report on it. So that when I go drive it, it drives fine, but I don't know about anything else about it. Well, the inspection report kind of lets me know that I'm getting a good product. So get that good neighborhood. Get that good 3 to 4 bedroom. Get that good 2-car garage, lots of storage, near good schools, homes in good shape. Fenced in yard, especially people that have pets like dogs. So think about getting the best neighborhood first and then getting the best 3 to 4 bedrooms. You will have a line around the block if you can get a good reputation for selling that property on terms and helping the seller sell to a buyer that needs a little bit of help getting financing. Here's another question. What does an ideal tenant buyer look like in a lease option assignment? What's their income look like? What's their education look like? What do their goals look like? Well, here's their income. What I look for, combined income. I like moms and dads that both have jobs. I like kids over 6 or 7 or 8 years of age. And I know you can't discriminate with the housing laws and everything else, but that's what I like to see. And a rule of thumb is 3.5 times whatever the rent is, I'd like to see in gross income, 3.5 times. So if they're grossing $3,500, I don't want them paying rent more than $1,000. That's 3.5 times. All right, education. I really think that people that are smart like lease options. They like rent to own, and they want to get into a neighborhood today, and they want to leg up, and they want to be able to get ahead. I want people that have goals. I want people that are driven. They don't mind going to night school to get ahead. They like to save. They like to see a financial planner. They don't want to react with life. They want to plan. And also, if their credit's been hurt, I want them to be very sincere about getting their credit better. And they know that if they go through our credit improvement program, they'll do that. So what agreements and forms are used? Well, we use many different agreements, but here are the core agreements that we use. We use a lease agreement, and we generally use our state's lease agreement. And our students use their state's lease agreement. And then we have a purchase option agreement that's separate. We use a repair addendum if there's any repairs to be done. Generally, we don't do much repairs. Lease deposit receipt. This is the legal separate form that we use, that when they sign the lease and they put money, first and last month's rent down as security, they get a separate form. That's a lease deposit receipt. Then they get another receipt, and there are two different checks. It's an option fee receipt, and it's non-refundable, and it screams that these funds are non-refundable. Okay, so those are the core agreements that we use. Common mistakes with lease options on the buyer side. This is the tenant buyer that's moving in. We got to underwrite this tenant buyer a little bit. Not only do we have to check the basic things that any good tenant, landlord-tenant application, but we got to, look at their income. We got to look at their debt-to-earnings ratio. We got to look at their credit report. We got to look at their job history and their references. So those are the basic core things that we do there. The tenant buyer must enroll in our credit improvement program with an approved FICO coach. We don't let anybody move in or sign agreements unless they're willing to do that. There's a cost to do that. It's $200 per person. And if it's a married couple with both credit problems, it's going to be $400 to get started. It's going to be $100 per person times 2 if it's 2 people, or $200 a month. And that's going to have to be paid every month for about 6 months at least, sometimes 8 months. So that's how the credit improvement fees work. And what's lovely about that service is their FICO scores go up between 100 and 200 points within 6 to 8 months, so that they can get a great rate on a good mortgage. They must disclose to the tenant buyer that you're not the owner if you're subject to leasing and subject to optioning, or that if you're assigning the deal. And I have that in a CYA form. I let the tenant buyer know that I'm not the owner, but I do have a legal interest in the property because I've signed a lease and an option to purchase agreement, and the owner has allowed me to assign that deal. You've got to get the full option fee from the tenant buyer, or at least get a promissory note. It's so important to get as much money as possible before you give them the keys and they move all their stuff in. Because if they don't give you the balance, then you have to, what are you going to have to do? You have to bring them to court and all sorts of things. And possession is 9/10 of the law. So, get all your money, or at least a very strong promissory note, and with some kind of security, not an unsecured promissory note. Get a car or something that they own and put it up for collateral. You must have seller or the buyer split the closing costs so that you and the sandwich lease option don't have any closing costs. Well, that's got to do with a sandwich. If you're just doing an assignment, you don't have any closing costs to worry about. So you can have the seller and the buyer split the closing costs, or have the buyer pay all the closing costs. It really doesn't matter. It's all negotiable. Now here's on the seller side. You're dealing with the seller or the owner, and you don't want to give the seller too large of a down payment or an option fee, either one. And if you don't get a title search, you're being silly. You've got to make sure that they own the property and that there's no liens against the property. Going through using a land trust to protect them the seller in case they get sued or they have mechanics liens or any other kind of liens against the property. A land trust is going to help do that. Not using a third-party payee to pay the mortgage, taxes, and insurance. One of the biggest problems in lease options is the buyer sends money directly to the seller, and the seller doesn't pay the mortgage, or they don't pay the insurance, or they don't pay the taxes. I'm not saying they do it on purpose, but there's mistakes. So using a third-party payee system, a collection system that collects all that money and sends the money out on time is worthwhile the fee of $25 to $40 a month. Making sure you're not getting several months paid before you pay rent to the seller. I like to tell the sellers is, look, you're going to make the next 2 payments no matter what. And because we're going to be moving somebody in, and then they have to give notice at least 30 days, and usually it takes them another 15 days. So the next 2 months, you're going to be making payments. It's very important that you get the seller to sign all the CYA disclosures, and I basically have a letter of intent that they sign that describes all that stuff, and it's very simple. Getting involved with major repair work is really dicey, especially if you don't have any contractors experience. I don't have any contractors experience, and when I see a problem, I don't want to get involved with a big repair job. So it's up to you. Dealing with cheap houses and poor buyers that don't have any money, or they're on government assistance, whatever. I don't care for that. I like high income people, and if there's a problem in the house, they can fix it, and they can pay their rent on time. Not knowing market prices in home values and in home rents, it's very important to know that information. If you have a hard time finding values or finding rent information, let me know. So I'm going to show these 2 screens. I'm going to use a Sandwich Lease Option screen and a Lease Option Assignment screen. Sandwich Lease Option, you basically get the spreads between several things. One is the rent. So if you're getting $1,100 a month from the tenant buyer and you're paying $900 a month to the owner, then your spread is this, the $200. If you're giving $10 a month here for the option fee, for the option to the seller, and you're getting 3%, in this case it's $31.50, you're going to get the balance, which is $31.40 here. If you pay first and last month's rent of $1,800 and you pay $2,200 from the tenant buyer, you're going to get a spread of $400 every month. And on the back end, if you promised, if you worked out an arrangement on a sandwich where it's $90,000 to buy the property anytime during 3 years, and you got a deal to get $105,000 on the tenant buyer anytime during 3 years. The difference is your spread on the back end. Okay? Very important in a sandwich that you have a performance lease that if the tenant buyer doesn't pay you, you don't have to pay the seller. It's very hard to get the seller to agree to that. It's very important here to make sure that the tenant buyer has a credit improvement specialist working with them when they move in, and they don't get the keys until they agree to pay for that. And minor maintenance is paid under $100, like a faucet or a stuffed up toilet or something like that. So let's go through the lease option assignment. Well, basically, if you're renting market rent, it doesn't change. It's the same. You're doing it from the owner, $1,000, and you're passing that rent on for $1,000. Option fee, you're giving $10 to the seller to get your lease and your option, but you're going to charge an option release fee of approximately 3% or $5,000 for your option release fee. Your first and last month's rent, if it's $1,800, it stays the same. And the back end is it doesn't come into play because you're not doing a double close. You're just assigning the deal for a fee. You don't have a performance lease because you're not in a sandwich. You're assigning the deal, And these two things are still important, the credit improvement and the minor maintenance. So this problem, what if the tenant buyer doesn't pay you, the real estate investor, or can you, the REI, afford to evict and clean and remarket the property and pay the mortgage and the taxes and insurance? Well, lease option assignment, there's no potential problem because you don't have that problem. Not with a lease option assignment, but you do have it with a sandwich lease option. So to recap, I love lease option assignments. There's no rehabs. I work with a pen, not a hammer. I have quick profits. I can generally make some money within 60 days. Many homes need us. There's a lot of no equity homes. There's over 20 million homes right now in the United States that have very little equity in them. And some of them are underwater. And you can do long-term lease options for underwater homes. Seller and buyer, they get a good deal unless they get a good deal unlike a wholesale deal. So remember, I really wanted to say the seller and the buyer win. Well, the seller, what do? They get top sales price without a real estate agent's commission, and they get no closing costs generally the way we set it up. And they generally have no seller's concessions. And they don't have to deal with price reductions. So they net more money if they help the buyer buy it. And the buyer gets their neighborhood today, they get their school district today, they get a beautiful house today, especially above the median homes. They're not the cheap homes. Everybody wins. And I get paid in 60 days or less, generally at least $5,000, and it takes less than 10 hours for the deal. So that's why I really like lease option assignments. And when I'm coaching somebody, I encourage them to start with lease option assignments and get at least 20 of those done as fast as possible. So the next installment of this lease option training is going to be what if situations with the tenant buyer. What if this happens? What if that happens? Here's a prelude to it. What if the tenant buyer doesn't make the payments? What if the tenant buyer decides they don't want to buy? What do you do? What if the tenant buyer fails to be able to exercise the option and get financing? And what if the tenant buyer bails out on me and just picks up and leaves? What if the tenant buyer exercises their option too soon to do a 1031 exchange? And we'll explain that to you. What if the tenant buyer declares bankruptcy? What if the tenant buyer records their lease option? So those things will be addressed in the next one, the what ifs. So thank you for listening to this presentation on lease option assignments. This is Brian Gibbons with REI Skills. Thanks for listening to this recording, and I really look forward to working with you. If you just give me a call at 626-318-0599 or email me at team@reiskills.com. I just look forward to helping you and your family make a good amount of money in 2013. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation. Bye for now.